Dr. David McCoy. It's such a pleasure to introduce Dave, who's just such a fantastic leader of Medact and all of the work that it does. I'm very much, very glad that he now has the last speaking slot on this plenary. He's a public health physician and an academic. He spent the first 15 years of his working life in clinical medicine and strengthening health systems, mostly in South Africa. He came from South Africa, our benefit, their loss, to come and live in London, and has worked on many different, almost all aspects of global health as a public health specialist in the NHS, where he was a director of public health here in London. Right now, he divides his time between being director of Medact and also working at Queen Mary's University. His two great contributions, I think, have been the two alternative World Health Reports, Global Health Watch, that I hope you've all had a chance to read. Fantastic documents, both of them, and I hope there'll be a third one at some point as well. And he's a member of the steering committee of the People's Health Movement. Please give a rousing welcome to Dave McCoy.
Thank you, Richard. Very kind words. It's pretty self-evident that war, conflict, and violence are not compatible with good health. I think this statement here is also pretty self-evident. This is from a resolution that was passed at the World Health Assembly in 1981. What is perhaps slightly less self-evident, but which has been made clear by the talk that Paul Rogers gave, by the talk that Andy Haynes gave this morning, by what Ira has talked about, is perhaps the nature and scale of the challenge that war, conflict, and violence presents to us as a health community. I think what we've learnt over the last day and a half is that we're really dealing with a set of large, complex, and interconnected problems. We've learnt about the ecological threats to health, how they relate to conflict and violence and war. Paul Rogers spoke eloquently about the rising tide of frustrated expectations that arise from growing inequalities, social and economic inequalities, and how this too contributes not just to conflict and violence, but also to ecological degradation. So we're talking about a set of complex, interconnected challenges, and this is one reason why Medact exists as an organization with an impossibly large scope of action. We have programs that deal with peace and security, we have a climate and ecology program, we have an economic justice program, we have a human rights program, and people will say to us, "You're mad. How can you possibly campaign on all of these things?" And it seems to me that it's simply not feasible not to be campaigning on all of these things because they are all interconnected. So I think that's one message. The second, about the nature and scale of what we're dealing with, is that these issues, these problems that we face are serious, existential even. And that it's both the complexity and the nature of the seriousness of these issues that are really relevant to informing how we go about addressing them. We can't be looking for small piecemeal solutions. We can't be working in silos. We can't be simply working on one disease. We certainly can't just be addressing the humanitarian aspects of these problems. We're going to have to work upstream and downstream. We're going to have to provide curative care. We're going to have to prevent these problems from happening. We are talking literally about how we change the way we manage ourselves as a family of nations, sharing and living on a single, finite, and fragile planet. a humanitarian response is inadequate. It's important but inadequate by itself. And as described already by Andy and Ben, and perhaps best described even earlier by Albert Einstein, peace cannot be kept by force. The controlled paradigm that Paul Rogers spoke about yesterday is not only ineffective, but also tends to be unjust, undemocratic, violating of human rights, and furthermore counterproductive, breeding even more fear, more conflict, more violence, more war. Not all politicians are one-eyed when it comes to forging national security policies. In this country, there is no doubt that we need to forge a new approach to national security, one that is led by civilians and not by the military establishment. But I think the problem is much deeper than just a misjudgment of tactics about how we secure our security, how we achieve security. What's important to understand, and I think which was really explained by Andrew Feinstein and described in detail in his book, Shadow World, is that there are also people, individuals, organizations who see war, conflict, violence, fear, and insecurity as something good. People, institutions, organizations who seek to encourage and manufacture war and conflict, who seek to encourage and manufacture fear and hatred, such as described by Ben earlier. And these are not just the arms manufacturers or the private military and security companies that are now proliferating across the world. Not just the military establishment who have a vested interest to justify and magnify their existence in society, but also our politicians. As noted by Andrew yesterday, it is our politicians who are the biggest arms dealers on the planet. He talked about the corrosive effect of the arms trade in terms of corrupting government, undermining democracy, violating human rights, and undermining decency. So as a health community, we cannot, I think, ignore the arms trade as a social pathogen. And in the same way, and perhaps with even more energy and effort that we fight sugar, alcohol, and tobacco, so must we fight the arms trade. Nothing is probably more pathogenic and pathological right now than the pattern of arms sales to the Middle East, often to both sides of a war or conflict, and the role that our elected politicians shamelessly play in keeping the Middle East in conflict. And perhaps nothing is therefore more shameful and outrageous than the response of these same politicians to the plight of innocent people seeking refuge. So, what's to be done? What can be done? Well, I think the first thing to say is that we have to do something. Whether for practical and scientific reasons or for moral and social reasons, we have to respond to this. We have to do something. We have to respond with our head. We have to respond with our heart. Here is a quote from a former Nobel Peace Prize winner. And I think the quote really speaks to the fact that to respond to these issues in the way that they need to be responded to, we need to have courage and we need to have commitment. This is Oscar Arias Sanchez again, being quoted about the need to be both idealistic and pragmatic. We have to use our head, we have to use our heart, and we have to act with our conscience. But I want to finish now by saying something about not just our duty and our mandate to act as health workers, but more importantly, and I think it touches a little bit on what Viv was talking about earlier, it's our opportunity to do so. We have much to offer. The first thing is that we have privilege. We have a social standing. We have an economic standing in society where we can speak truth to power, where we can be protected when we speak truth to power in ways that many other people aren't. The second thing is that we have legitimacy. We're on the front line, bearing witness to the effects of war and conflict. We, our community, treat and manage the sequelae of war and conflict on a daily basis. We are scientists. We have evidence. We can study. We can describe. We can explain. We can educate. So we have a voice that we must use. On your seats, you will see that we've drafted a statement that we hope to be able to produce as an outcome of this conference. This is a draft statement. We'd like to invite you to look at it, comment on it, suggest modifications, and over the next 2 or 3 weeks, we will try and produce a final statement that we will hope to have everyone who attended this conference sign up to, and more people to sign up to. So please have a look at it and give us your feedback, and look out for the final statement appearing in 2 or 3 weeks' time. The third thing is that we have a variety of cultures and practices that we can apply. The culture of compassion, the culture of care, professional ethics, all of which can help us to act as leaders in society to change and address some of these big, complex and challenging issues. As health workers, we are also familiar with the need to and the ease with which we can work across national boundaries, across cultures. I mean, the Lancet Commissions, IPPNW, World Medical Association, there are countless examples of how health professionals are able to work across national, cultural, religious, ethnic boundaries and divides. We have many great role models that we can draw inspiration from, whether it be Florence Nightingale, Rudolf Virchow, Steve Biko, Salvador Allende. There are many. And indeed, we ourselves are many. Here in the UK, the health community makes up more than 1 million people of the population, if you take into account retired health workers and students. We are a big voice. We're a strong voice. One of the campaigns that Medact is involved in is in the campaign to divest from fossil fuels. And when I talk about this campaign, I sometimes refer to the abolition of the slave trade. Because in many ways, the abolition of the slave trade was really a campaign against another form of energy. I mean, slaves were essentially a form of energy embodied in the slaves, transported from one continent to the other to provide energy in order to produce cotton and a variety of other things. And when the campaign took off to abolish slave trade, the same arguments were made about we can't possibly do this because it would damage our economy. And in the same way that fossil fuels forms the basis of our economy today, the slave trade formed the basis of much of the UK's economy back in the 19th century. How did the slave trade become abolished? I think the most important lesson from this was that it wasn't just William Wilberforce making a case in Parliament and Parliament enacting a new act. Prior to that was the fact that there were literally hundreds of people all across England and Scotland who were speaking about the slave trade and calling for its abolition in village halls, in churches, in pubs, up and down the country. It didn't take one person. It took an army of people who went out to convince and change public opinion. If ever there was an example of Parliament being led by the people, this is it. It was Parliament leading the people and not, sorry, it was people leading Parliament and not Parliament leading the people. And that's what we need right now, here and today. Ira talked about the heavy burden of all these facts, all these threats, these concerns, these worries about the future. And it is a burden. But I also want to say that at the end of today, at the end of the afternoon session, there will also be a session of culture, music, in order for us to remind ourselves that we also need to celebrate what's good in humanity. And after that, we're all going to go to the pub, where there will be live music and dancing, in order to remind ourselves also of the fact that we have a duty to enjoy life. Thank you.